because it's a very big building and most of it isn't there anymore. Adam of Domerham, the Abbey's 13th century chronicler, tells us that on the 24th of May 1184, on St Urban's Day, fire destroyed the whole abbey except the chamber built by Abbot Robert with its chapel. Here the monks took refuge, and the bell tower built by Abbot Henry. The glorious buildings lately built by Abbot Henry, the world-famous shrine, the church, the resting place of saints, all were reduced to a heap of ashes. Only those who have witnessed a similar disaster can imagine the desolation of the monks, and even at this distance of time, one can hardly hear of the destruction of the relics, treasures, vestments and books and remain unmoved. No part of the standing building at Glastonbury predates this fire, confirming Domerham's account of its severity. As with any disaster, remedial work must have begun almost at once, probably focusing initially on providing temporary accommodation for the community, but also including the reconstruction of the Western Lady Chapel, with the Vetusta Ecclesia, the ancient church upon which Glastonbury's fame was based. According to Domerham, Ralph Fitzstephen, in charge of the rebuilding, completed the Church of St Mary in the place where from the beginning the Vetusta Ecclesia had stood, building it of squared stones of the most beautiful workmanship, omitting no possible ornament. It was dedicated by Reginald, Bishop of Bath, on St Barnabas Day, June the 11th, AD 1186, Circuiter. He repaired all the offices of the monastery and lastly laid the foundations of the Ecclesia Major, 400 feet in length and 80 feet in breadth. In the process, the ruin was plundered for reusable stone, and Domerham gives us a picture of the extent of the architectural salvage involved. In the foundations of the church were placed the stones not only of the great palace built by Bishop Henry, but of the entire wall which surrounded the court of the monastery. The 1930 to 1931 excavations exposed the southern sleeper wall foundation of the crossing of the great church, and the report states that this was found to be built with stones from the Norman church. They were known by their red colour, having been in the Great Fire, and pieces of Norman carving and other fragments of worked stone of that date had all been used up in the construction of this huge wall. The ruins of the burnt-out church were ready to hand, its foundations in some places probably in the way of the newer church, and so all that was left of Herwin's building after the fire went into this pair of sleeper walls, which have thus swallowed up nearly every trace of the Norman church. This cannibalisation of the ruined buildings can also be seen above ground in the lower walls of the new Lady Chapel, almost certainly designating it as the work of the first season of reconstruction after the fire, and probably datable to the summer and autumn of 1184. Not only are identifiable Romanesque fragments incorporated into the fabric, but Bathstone, which is scarcely found at Glastonbury after the Norman conquest until the 1320s, is plentiful in the lower half of the structure, but absent above this. This distribution suggests a 2-year campaign, if Domerham's 1186 date for its dedication is correct, or perhaps 3 years if his use of circuiter suggests some doubt about the chronology. Work on the reconstruction of the Great Church must have been directly contemporary with the rebuilding of the Lady Chapel. But while the foundations of the East End could have been laid in 1184, its superstructure was probably not begun until 1185, since there is no trace of the architectural salvage seen in the first season of work in the Lady Chapel. That they are contemporary, however, can be shown by the distribution of the foiled leaf foliage of the decorative carving in the two buildings. The style of foliate decoration seen elsewhere at Keynsham Abbey and Worcester Cathedral is characteristic of both the Lady Chapel and the choir aisle windows at Glastonbury, but disappears from both before 1189, probably around 1187. In the Lady Chapel, the carver of the north door used the foiled leaf exclusively in the outer two orders, but mixed foiled and stiff leaf in the middle order, abandoning it altogether in the inner order. The unfinished carving of the south door employs only stiff leaf. In the choir, the arcades and the aisle windows show a mixture of the two leaf types, sometimes on the same object, and their distribution pattern suggests that two carvers were working side by side, one in the older tradition, the other exclusively in the stiff leaf style. But at the height of the springing of the aisle vaults, the foiled leaf disappears. Both the Lady Chapel and the lower parts of the choir are built in courses which average around 22 centimetres in height, diagonally tall dolting stone, with carving block usually from the Dundry quarries just south of Bristol. The fine-grained Dundry stone has been previously identified as the block generally employed in the Romanesque period at Glastonbury, However, the only pieces so designated in the recent examination of the Romanesque corpus, despite their stylistic affinities, belong to the post-1184 rebuilding, and the use of Dundry stone can be regarded as a marker of the earliest phase of the reconstruction, probably being used only between 1184 and 1189. These distribution patterns show that the choir to near the springing of the high vaults and the circuit of at least the south wall of the nave, as far as the door to the west cloister, belong to the first phase of rebuilding. The base of the south nave aisle wall to the height of the window sills was required to complete the north walk of the cloister, rather than being needed as part of the great church, and probably does not imply that work on the nave was seriously advanced at this early date. During the survey of the southeastern crossing pier, a series of small wooden wedges were found at the level of the base of the clerestory, which probably represent the fixer mason's wedges from the setting of the stone in the late 12th century. These would normally have been removed once the mortar was leather hard, but had clearly been left in situ until the mortar had fully set and the wedges had subsequently been cut off flush with the wall face. This is an indication that the rising building had been left unmaintained, the masons having left the site unattended. This height is also the point at which Dundry stone disappears from the building and where the average course height begins to rise. Taken with the unfinished state of the south door of the Lady Chapel, this suggests that the situation described by Adam of Domerum following the death of Henry II on the 6th of July 1189 is accurate, and that the withdrawal of royal patronage under Richard I led to a situation where, as he says, the work stopped because no funds were forthcoming to pay the wages of the workmen. Enough of the choir had been built by this time that the eastern chapels and the choir aisles could have been brought into use, so that the liturgy could have been celebrated in both the Lady Chapel and the eastern chapels of the great church. That this was part of the overall strategy of the rebuilding is suggested by the presence of doorways in both the south and the north choir aisles in the third bay east of the crossing. Both doorways appear to have been blocked up in the Middle Ages, though that on the south may have continued to serve a small building whose scars are present on the exterior. These could have functioned as processional and access doorways prior to the extension of the building into the eastern aisles of the transepts. That the choir aisles and the eastern transept aisles were the products of the separate phases in which the building came into use is also suggested by differences in their earliest decorative schemes. The painting of the choir having a thin ochre ground, the transept a white plaster ground, and these two styles of decoration meet at the arches from the choir into the transepts. The disaster of 1184 must certainly have had much wider repercussions in the vicinity. The drain on resources and manpower which the rebuilding of the abbey must have caused probably impacted upon the new church at Wells, which had been under construction since the 1170s, using stone from the abbey's quarries at Dolting. The 1184 fire at Glastonbury seems the likeliest cause for the builders at Wells switching quarries from Dolting, whose output would certainly have been diverted to Glastonbury in the summer of 1184, to Chilcot, a stone of significantly poorer quality. The limited corpus of surviving masons' marks at Glastonbury also suggests that masons were moving from Wells to Glastonbury at the time when the source of their stone supply changed. The subsequent temporary hiatus in building at Glastonbury in 1189 may be reflected in a brief reappearance of Dolting stone at Wells in the western triforium of the transept, where it forms a sandwich above the Chilcot stone arcade and beneath the Chilcot clerestory. At Wells, the building of the new church can be analysed in some detail, and insights from the process of construction there can be applied at Glastonbury, where so much less of the fabric remains. For instance, Wells was built in a series of modules, each of which could be brought into use by the clergy, while a temporary wall divided the working church from the building site to the west, and temporary doorways serving each module of the building were provided for access and processions, the eastern series of these being blocked up as the area of the new building coming into use expanded and they were no longer needed. At Glastonbury, the existence of the temporary choir aisle doorways has already been referred to, and there is a further doorway at the end of the north transept's eastern aisle which must have served the completed choir while the transept was being built. Bly Bond in 1921 said of it, "This doorway had been solidly blocked. The blocking seemed to me of comparatively early date. The stone of the blocking is of shallow, coarse, diagonally tall Dolting, consistent with a late 12th or early 13th century date." At Wells, the choir construction phase ends with the turn of the masonry onto the east wall of the transept at clerestory level, and at Glastonbury a change in the block size occurs at exactly the same point. This also marks the point at which blue lias may have been introduced into the architecture of the great church, it being absent in the surviving fabric to the east, where Dalting stone is being painted black in imitation of its natural polychromy, probably because the masons who specialised in its use were concentrating their efforts on the adornment of the Lady Chapel. Howard Watkin provided Raleigh Radford with a chronicle reference stating that the convent of Glastonbury entered their new church at Christmas 1213. If the choir was complete to the base of the clerestory in 1189, it seems unlikely that this refers to only the eastern arm of the great church, consisting of the 4 bays east of the crossing, and it is probable that the whole of the transept, with the ritual choir running beneath the base of the central tower, is being designated here. The turbulent period in the Abbey's history following the death of Henry II, and including the abbacy of Saverick, Bishop of Bath and Glastonbury, may well have meant that a further 24 years were required to reach this point in the reconstruction of the great church. At Wells, where the choir was complete around 1184, and the transept was in use by 1204, a similar period was required for the construction of their transept. The extent of the transept phase and its westward shoring against the crossing can be identified in the eastern surviving bay of the south nave aisle, where above the 1184-9 masonry related to the reconstruction of the north cloister, the courses are significantly deeper than those of the early work beneath, but not as deep as those of the upper masonry to the west. The latter, belonging to the first phase of the reconstruction of the nave, have course depths averaging 35 centimetres and are vertically tooled, a style of masonry which also defines the mid-nave break at Wells Cathedral, datable on the basis of dendrochronology to shortly after 1213. So little remains of the nave that its analysis may always remain elusive, although the scaffolding of the west wall next year may allow some new insights to be made. There was clearly a hiatus in the erection of the vaulting of the western nave, since the surviving western bay of the south nave aisle has a 14th century vault springer. But the fact that the Galilee is in bond with the west wall of the nave shows that this element of the church was planned before and probably erected shortly after the middle of the 13th century. The Galilee would only have been relevant if the nave was already a usable space, suggesting that the whole of the great church may have been roofed well before the nave vaulting was completed under Abbot Adam of Sodbury, abbot between 1323 and 1334. The Galilee was certainly in use by 1294, when the altar of All Saints, quote, built in a place called Galilee, which place is situate between the great monastery and the chapel of the Blessed Virgin Mary, is referred to in Speximus. No consideration of the history of the great church would be complete without reference to the 2-bay extension of the choir under Abbot Walter Monington, abbot between 1342 and 1375. John Leland, who saw it complete, said of the choir, "There be 6 goodly windows in the top of each side of the east part of the church. There were 4 of old time, since 2 added, and the presbytery enlonged," beautiful word, by Walter Monington, abbot. Usually seen as reflecting the remodelling of the choir of Gloucester Cathedral, it may equally have received its impetus from the extension and remodelling of the choir of Wells in the 1330s by the master mason William Joy, particularly since some of the masons employed in the latter project had previously worked on the abbot's lodging and the abbot's kitchen at Glastonbury in the 1320s. In the choir aisles, the new panelling of the 14th century remodelling was not employed, and the architecture of the 2 added eastern bays is remarkably similar to that of the 12th century bays to the west. Willis, in 1866, argued that the termination of the 12th century work and its junction with the 2-bay mid-14th century extension lies at the western margin of Bay 7, along the tooth joint with its western wall shaft. However, this joint is the result of Monington's insertion of new stonework into fabric reconstructed in the 14th century from extensive reuse of 12th century masonry. The true termination of the 12th century fabric lies at the centre of Bay 6, where there is a tooth joint in the ashlar and the built-in section of the wall bench ends. Above the windowsill, it seems to have been necessary to rebuild the whole of the 12th century extent of Bay 6, there being a tooth joint at the western margin of the bay adjacent to the wall shaft on both interior and exterior, and the capital of this shaft is the first to lie at the height of the vault springers of the Monington period work to the east. The collapse of the eastern half of Bay 5 is probably the result of the natural line of weakness at the junction between the two builds. That the upper part of Bay 6 was rebuilt as part of the Monington extension can be seen by the way in which the 17mm diameter drilled holes which characterise the ferramenta fixing points of the western 12th century windows are present in the window jambs of this bay, but do not match across the opening. And also that the groups of 3 small recesses which are found at the springing line of the western windows, where there were probably seatings for the 12th century centering, are absent or displaced in this window. The reuse of the window in Bay 6 is just one part of the general re-erection of the 12th century East End masonry in the 14th century extension of the choir. Previous commentators have noted the similarities between the windows of the east and west sections of the choir aisle wall without drawing the implication that these must have been reused from the earlier building. However, the sections of the bases and abacuses and the style of the capitals and the chevron work is identical, and where 14th century carved work does appear, as in the 2 easternmost vault-springing capitals, it is clearly of its period, rather than being imitations copying the earlier work. Furthermore, the geological origin of the carved and moulded work using Dundry stone conforms to the practice of the workshop during the restricted period of 1184 to 9, and the occasional use of Dundry in the ashlar work is also found in these nominally 14th century bays. Where bona fide 14th century ashlars can be identified, they are of much greater size than the reused material, whose course heights conform to the remainder of the 12th century choir, and the 14th century dolting stone is of a coarser and more open texture. While the 14th century reworking of the choir salvaged carved work, vault rib voussoirs and ashlar facings, there are specific technical markers which serve to identify it as a rebuilding rather than being the incorporation of in situ 12th century work. Thus, the 12th century slots to accommodate the centering for the vaults are absent in the extension, whereas the bonders above the wall rib are restricted to the newer bays. Monington's masons used a brown mortar unlike the pale lime mortars of the 12th century, and oyster shell gallets are exclusive to the eastern bays. The wall cores and the facing above the vaulting also differ across the break. What inspired this careful reuse of the 12th century masonry in the extension of the 14th century choir? Glastonbury's architectural heritage seems firmly rooted in the past, even during the initial post-1184 reconstruction. The first element of the rebuilding, the Lady Chapel, is a deliberately retrospective monument. The Romanesque style of this chapel shows a consciousness of the expectation of an ancient site. The pilgrim approaching the abbey would know at a glance that this was the ancient church of legend, even though it was newly built, being constructed in a Romanesque idiom, while the rising church to the east was a fully Gothic structure. Indeed, the surviving impression of the pre-1184 seal of the abbey suggested to William St. John Hope that the architect of the Lady Chapel may have been attempting to recreate the physical appearance of the lost Vetusta Ecclesia. He says, this seal gives what appears to be the only known representation of Glastonbury Abbey before the Great Fire of 1184. It shows the monastic church viewed from the west. In the foreground is the Vetusta Ecclesia, or wattle church, a smallish building with western turrets each topped with a small pepperbox cap. It is interesting to notice the similarity of the wattle church to the stone Lady Chapel which succeeded it, and it is clear that the latter is intended to be a copy in stone of its predecessor. Building outside the style of the times is more common than many of us who rely upon stylistic analysis for dating buildings would care to concede, but the Lady Chapel of Glastonbury Abbey is as retrospective architecturally as it is advanced sculpturally. Even in the great church of the late 12th century, the adaptation of the Romanesque giant order to a Gothic idiom may reflect the conscious wish of the convent to perpetuate a taste of the former appearance of Hurlwyn's church. In this context, Monington's reuse of the hallowed stones of the 12th century choir may represent a further instance of Glastonbury's obsession with her ancient roots. It is a matter of some irony that the two most stylistically distinct sections of the great church, the Romanesque Lady Chapel and the Gothic choir, can be shown to be directly contemporary, whereas the stylistically identical eastern and western phases of the choir aisles were actually erected 170 years apart. I should have 2 minutes of injury time left, if I've timed it right. Very quick 2 minutes, promise. Thanks to Cheryl's wonderful work, I've actually been able to overlay Radford's drawing of the east end of Hurwin's Church onto the geophysical survey, which show where the foundation trenches of the east end are. And this serves immediately to tell you that the two could not possibly have coexisted, that Hurwin's Church must have been taken down as part of the 1184 work, and probably that is why you don't see architectural salvage at the east end. These two were going on together. And the other thing is, rather than just relying on a plan, I've put together an axonometric to show the hypothetical development sequence of the church, which is quite interesting also in the light of what is happening contemporaneously at Wells. One thing that I would point out is the extent to which Ralph Fitzstephen has built to the west. So he's gone to Bay 8 of the nave, a point which Wells doesn't reach until its fifth phase of construction. Ralph Fitzstephen does it in 5 years of construction. And that reflects, in part, the fact that it's a monastic church and you need these parts of the building to abut the conventual buildings against. But it also suggests that this is a man who isn't constrained by financial problems, that he's able to build the layer cake. He's building the whole thing as a single unit, whereas at Wells you can see quite clearly the modular construction. And this modular construction really only kicks in after the financial problems start to bite in 1189. So that in the upper works you can see the separate modules of the 4-bay choir upper work, the transept, probably built from the south to the north. Wells builds from north to south, as does Washington DC in the 20th century, and then the nave in at least 2 and probably more bites. I've finished.